Good evening and welcome to this second Lawyers Group event of 2021. I can see from the icon at the bottom of my screen that many people who have signed up are not yet here, but the numbers attending are going up every few seconds. So I will start my introduction now, and hopefully by the time I've finished, everyone who wants to be here will be here. My name is Rupert Jackson, and I'm chairman of the Lawyers Group of Classics for All. As explained last time, these events are provided for members of the Lawyers Group of Classics for All as a thank you for the generous contributions and subscriptions which they pay to help fund the teaching of classics in state schools. But apart from the Lawyers Group members, I also welcome all the other guests who are here tonight. They have kindly made donations to attend this evening. One of the benefits of Zoom is that we can invite so many members of the public to join our events. This is not only the second Lawyers Group event of 2021, it is also the second lecture by Professor Grayling. His first lecture was on the 11th of March under the title, What the Stoics Can Teach Us About Living Through the COVID-19 Crisis. That lecture was so popular that people called for a sequel. Well, tonight's lecture is that sequel. The ground rules are the same as usual. There is a question and answer box. The professor's lecture will last for about 40 minutes. You can put any questions which you have in the Q&A box. At the end of the lecture, we will have a Q&A session. I will sift through your questions and ask as many of them as time allows. So please feel free to put your questions in. I remember that last time we had a flood of extremely good questions. I'm sure the same will happen tonight. You can use the chat function to raise any technical issues. CFA, Classics for All staff members are on hand to offer support. Tonight's speaker, Professor A.C. Grayling, is a distinguished philosopher, a prolific author and lecturer. His excellent history of philosophy, which I hold up now, is one of his more recent publications. And it is indeed a very excellent work. I gather that he has another book which is going to be published next week, and he will be talking about that shortly on an Intelligence Squared event. Professor Grayling is the founder and principal of the New College of the Humanities. He is also a fellow of St. Anne's College, Oxford. I have been furnished with a long list of his achievements and prestigious positions, but I will not read that out. Tonight, Professor Grayling will return to the topic of Stoicism and discuss how it influenced later generations, including Renaissance scholars. So I will now hand over to our speaker, Professor Grayling.
So Rupert, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure to be back and to respond to some requests received to talk a bit about the later influence of Stoicism in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And I'm very pleased to do that, not least because Stoicism has become something of a thing, as we say these days, in our contemporary world. And that's an interesting phenomenon because it is a philosophical outlook which is very well adapted to an age which is much more secular, where there is much less loyalty, at least in what had been the areas of Christendom, if you like, to some particular version of a religion. But in order to explain this, I need to take a step or two back historically in order to situate Stoicism and the doctrines of Stoicism a little bit more clearly. a little bit like taking a run up for a high jump. So I have to remind you, I know you know this, that Socrates, who died in 399, so at the very, very beginning of the 4th century BCE, had left a legacy which was very multiple in its effects. Not just, of course, Plato and then Plato's pupil Aristotle and the lineage of philosophical thinking that flows from those two great fountains of debate, but also in the thought, in the minds, and indeed in the commitments of a number of other individuals. One in particular, who was a pupil of Socrates, a man called Antisthenes, took something from Socrates' teaching rather different from what Plato took from it. And this was the line that led to Stoicism in the century that followed Antisthenes' own time, and therefore gave an impetus to the whole story of Stoicism. So that little bit of history, I think, is important, and I want to tell you about that first as follows. Plato was a young man. He was in his late 20s when Socrates died. He wasn't close to Socrates in the sense of being an intimate friend. He was one among a number of people who had listened to Socrates' discourses and who had, of course, picked up a great deal, both of the approach to thinking about things that Socrates took, but also, of course, a very vital interest of Socrates. You may remember that Socrates said of himself when young that he had gone to the schools of the philosophers, the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, those who had come before him, who were interested in the nature of the universe, the origins and nature of existence, and what the universe is made of, what the principle of it is. And he had come to the view that the really important question, since those debates seemed to go round and round in circles, was the question, how should one live? What sort of person should one be? What values should shape our lives and guide our actions? And he was intensely interested in this and wanted to find out from his contemporaries what they thought about these matters. And indeed, he wanted to find out whether they had given sufficient thought to these matters, given that they were making very free use of terms like virtue, courage, nobility, generosity, and the like. And he wanted to know if they really had a good grasp of the meaning of these terms and whether that deep grasp of the meaning would influence the way that they lived. And so he challenged his fellow Athenians to the point of making a terrific nuisance of himself. As you know, he even described himself as a gadfly, stinging people into thinking about these things, because of course he very quickly found out that they hadn't really thought about them very deeply and didn't really know whether or not they were living in accordance with a true grasp of these ideas. Now, in that period of thought, and this great sort of classical period is remarkable for the fact that it wasn't enough to ask the question, how should one live and what are the values that one should live by? But it felt necessary to ask why those would be the values. What is it about the world and what is it about human beings that those should be the values that they live by? And therefore, ethics, which is the discussion about the nature of one's character, one's ethos, needs to sit on a firmer basis of metaphysics, of understanding of the nature of reality, of what the world really is like. And Socrates engaged in some discussion to that effect, but it was mainly, of course, Plato who took that aspect of things very much further. It was Plato who realized that if you were going to have an ethical stroke political view, because like his own pupil Aristotle, he thought of the ethical and the political as being continuous. The good life for the individual must be contextualized in the good society, and therefore questions about value range across both individual and collective considerations. Hence, the ethical life, the character, and the nature of the polis, of the political community, they were very, very closely related to one another. But they both needed to rest on this investigation, really, into the nature of humankind and the world that they occupied. And this is why Plato went into very great detail. I mean, really fine technical detail into questions of the nature of reality and of the possibility of knowledge of that reality in order to provide a basis for thinking about ethical questions. And this is something you find repeated again and again in many of the major figures of the philosophical tradition, that their aim ultimately was to be able to identify what the good ultimately is, but recognizing that that had to be predicated on a good understanding of what the world is and what we are in the world. So that was something very central to Plato's endeavor and to Aristotle's, because Aristotle also, you may remember, you were doubtless reading the Nicomachean Ethics again recently, you'll remember that he said there, what identifies the good for us, the nature of the good life, what picks out for us the virtues by which we live, is something that has to do with what is very distinctive about us as beings, and that is that we possess reason. We share in common with the rest of the world the fact that we need to eat, we need to reproduce ourselves, we move as the other animals do, but unlike the rest of nature, we have this very distinguishing feature, which is reason, and therefore the application of reason and living the prudential life, a life of thoughtfulness and consideration about what choices we make and what actions we take, will be what it is to live a good and flourishing life, a eudaimonic life. So that was the way that Aristotle developed these ideas. But in doing so, he was picking up on a very Socratic theme. Socrates had argued in his discourses and in his encounters with others that virtue, the good life, the good and virtuous life, is a life of knowledge, of knowing what the right thing is, knowing what the good thing is. He took the view that evil or ill or doing the wrong thing, acting badly, is a function of ignorance. It's because you don't know what the right thing is. And if you do know what the right thing is, how can you possibly do the wrong thing, he said. If you know the good, how can you do the bad? Well, Aristotle was a little bit less idealistic on that point. He recognized that, you're on a diet and you see a great big piece of chocolate cake and you eat it, knowing that that's the wrong thing to do, because he recognized this phenomenon that I'm afraid we all suffer from, which is weakness of will, akrasia. And this is a feature of our existence, of our moral lives, that has to be taken into account. And indeed is an important feature, therefore, of the application of reason to life, that we are able to overcome those impulses which will lead us away from our recognition of the good to actions which don't realize the good. So it was a much more realistic and psychologically more accurate account. But it did turn on this idea that the use of reason, the reasoned life, the considered life, because you'll remember Socrates' great point was that the good, the best kind of life is the considered life, the chosen life. And this is a theme that Aristotle develops, while at the same time recognizing, as I say, these psychological considerations also. So this idea of reason, of the application of reason, is one major strand that comes out of Socrates through Aristotle, and it does feed into Stoicism, as we'll see in a moment. The other strand that came out of Socrates, and which was picked up by his pupil Antisthenes, was Socrates' attitude towards the conventions, towards the fact that most people aspired to wealth, to honor, to fame, to a life of comfort or luxury, and he disdained all these things. Socrates was rather famous for being very hardy. So he was able, for example, to bear cold and hardship. He had a military career in which he displayed these characteristics of being, as people later came to call it, very stoical, able to endure excessive heat, excessive cold, hunger, thirst, and the like. And also famously, he used sometimes to stand for hours deep in thought, quite quite indifferent to how he felt, whether he was hungry or whether it was raining and so on. And this indifference to the external, this hardiness, was something which really struck Antisthenes, because it was predicated on a disdain, as I say, for all the conventionalities and all the normal things that people wanted to surround themselves with and the kind of life that they wanted to have. Now, Antisthenes was the founder of Cynicism, which is the hippie philosophy, the philosophy that you reject all those conventional things. You turn your nose up at the idea of wanting to live the soft life and have, lovely furnishings and carpets and so on. For example, Diogenes, his pupil, the famous Diogenes the Cynic, who lived in a barrel and who really quite alarmed the citizens of Athens by his behavior not quite in a way that I will describe in a moment, but for a reason I will describe in a moment. But he once famously went into Plato's house and stamped on the carpet in Plato's drawing room, saying, "I stamp on your pride thus." And Plato responded, as it happens, this is an anecdote told, I think, by Diogenes Laertius. He responded by saying, "In doing so, Diogenes, you display a different kind of pride," which may be true. But at any rate, Antisthenes and Diogenes completely spurned the conventions and these normal aims of life that people had. And they wanted to live as close as possible, as they put it, to nature. They wanted to first follow nature. That was a slogan which the Stoics themselves adopted later. But the idea, the concept comes from the Cynics. To the extent that Diogenes lived naked, he slept in this barrel, he performed all his natural functions in public, to the dismay and sometimes disgust of his fellow Athenians. And I think I reported the anecdote about him last time, that the one and only appurtenance he carried about with him was a cup, so that he could scoop up water and drink, until one day he saw a child scooping up water in his cupped hands. And Diogenes tore the cup off from the string around his neck and threw it away and said, "Even a child teaches me wisdom." So this was a very, very dramatic espousal of the life of a dog, so to speak, to be as close to nature as possible. Hence the idea of the Cynics. Now, a person who admired what Antisthenes and Diogenes were seeking to do in repudiating all the effeteness of civilization and of being as close and as true to nature as possible was a man called Crates, rather famous for having, himself had been a very wealthy individual, and he'd given up all his wealth to become a Cynic, to follow in the footsteps of Antisthenes and Diogenes. And his wife, Hipparchia, who had also come from a rather wealthy and comfortable family, who also rejected everything, much to her family's dismay, to join Crates in this life, the life of a Cynic. They became much beloved by the Athenian community. They were tremendously admired by the Athenians, and they were welcome everywhere, and very often were treated as marriage guidance counselors and as, advisors to offspring and so on. They were apparently a rather remarkable couple in that way. But they in their ability to relate to the community around them. So in other words, their rejection of it wasn't like Diogenes, a sort of sneering rejection of it, but instead was an attempt to live the Cynic life, so the sort of hippie life, as close as possible to the simplicities as they could get. That was something which really struck a visitor to Athens from Cyprus. And this was a man called Zeno, came from Citium in Cyprus. There's a story about how he had been shipwrecked, and he said this was the best thing that ever happened to him because it resulted in his having to go to Athens. And while he was there, he decided that he would study philosophy. He asked a bookseller who he should go to take instruction. And it just happened that Crates was walking past the bookshop at the time. So the story goes. And the bookseller said, well, there's a philosopher, you could follow him. And Zeno did so, became a disciple of Crates, and adopted from him a set of views, not entirely taking the Cynic outlook to heart, not wanting to go all the way to repudiating everything in society, but recognizing that you could internalize the Cynic virtues of simplicity and of closeness to nature, following nature as much as possible, but at the same time to have a relationship with the community in which you live and carry out your responsibilities to it, which in effect is what Crates and Hipparchia had been doing. But Zeno saw that this was something that you could elaborate. So you could have what looked like a perfectly normal life. So you could earn a living and you could take your part in the government of the polis. You could do all your civic responsibilities and duties, which the Cynics had rejected and wouldn't do, as it were. They didn't want to pay taxes to their society. But Zeno saw that you could do it and at the same time, nevertheless, live a life of genuine virtue, a life of simplicity, a life that would be as conformable as it could be to the order of nature. And there is the key idea, the order of nature. The fact that the world has a rational structure, that there is an unfolding regularity, a pattern of order in the universe, and that conformability to that order was what it was to live well. Now, this order in the universe was described by Zeno as its logos. Now, this is a word which has a very, very wide range of meanings. But basically, I mean, the basic meaning of it is word, as it happens, but its meaning in the philosophical context was reason or order or pattern or sort of rationality. The logos of the universe is the rational order of it. And it is living in conformity with the logos, with the rational order of things, that lay at the very, very heart of Zeno's view. And it is what underlay the ethics of Stoicism, which you'll remember from our discussion last time, is that with respect to those things that you cannot influence or control, things outside you, aging, earthquakes, and the rest, you must face them with courage. You must accept the fact that these things happen. If you rail against them, wail, if you feel angry or despairing, this is a function of your attitude. A very important principle for the Stoics is rather beautifully articulated by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, who said the meaning of things lies not in things themselves, but in our attitudes to them. And that was really key to the Stoic view. Our attitudes to things outside us give them their meaning. And if there's nothing that we can do about them, then we must be, instead of feeling the passions of despair and anger and misery and the rest, we must be pathetic, that is pathos, not have feelings about them. So apatheia in Greek doesn't quite mean what apathy means nowadays, but it means treating them on their merits. That is something that you can't do anything about. Therefore, you face them with courage. And what you can control or master, your own feelings, your own desires, your own appetites and fears, there you must try to achieve some degree of self-mastery. Courage to the outer, self-mastery to the inner. This was key. And for Zeno, this came from the idea that the universe has a logic, that the universe has an order, and that if you conform yourself to this order, one of the things that you recognize is that the universe's order, a very great deal of it, is not under your control. It is just what it is. You have to accept that fact. But that you do have this degree of reason that you can impose on your attitudes to things. And by imposing a control of reason on your feelings about things, you can recognize what is really good and worthwhile. And you can also discriminate between those things which it's nice to have, like, for example, having a wealth or having a nice home, having a good relationships and so on, but which are not absolutely essential to the ultimate, the final good, which is living in conformity with the world in such a way that you achieve inner stability and tranquility. these other things, by the way, wealth and the rest, which you prefer to have, but you don't have to have in order to live with ataraxia, were described as the things that are indifferent. Could have them, it's okay, they're nice to have, but you need them. You could dispense with them, you don't have to have them. And that is as it were, the structure that Zeno erected on this idea of the nature of the world and the logos in the world, a metaphysical view. Well, Zeno had some followers, Cleanthes and Chrysippus, who are major figures in the development of early Stoicism because they were very interested in logic. Zeno himself had been a pupil of Stilpo, who was a Megarian logician. He had also attended lectures at the Academy, Plato's Academy, and had debates with the skeptics, as they were called, the philosophers of the Academy, about the nature of knowledge and truth and the like. And so in that early period of Stoicism, there was a lot of deep thought about reality, about knowledge, about reason and logic, and about the way that they underlay this idea of how one should view the world and how one should master oneself. Now, all this was happening in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Around about 300 BCE is when Zeno began to study philosophy in Athens and to set up his own school shortly thereafter. And his followers, Cleanthes and Chrysippus, therefore lived in the 3rd century. And it's very important to not to collapse antiquity into, a little squash box, so that when we think of the early Stoics, like Zeno and his immediate followers, and then we think of Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius later, we sort of push them together because, in fact, a number of centuries elapsed between them. After all, Seneca and Epictetus both lived in the 1st century AD. Epictetus straddled the 1st and 2nd centuries, and Marcus Aurelius lived in the 2nd century AD, so several hundred years after Zeno. And during that time, Stoicism underwent a change. It went to change in the following sense. First, that all the metaphysics and logic that had attended the earlier thinking in Stoicism dropped out. And when Stoicism was introduced to the Roman world by a man called Panaetius of Rhodes in the 2nd century AD, and was picked up by people like Cicero, and Cicero wrote about Stoicism. He himself was influenced by the Stoics. He liked some aspects of Stoic ethics, although he himself was mainly a follower of the Platonic Academy when it came to things like metaphysics and the theory of knowledge. But the ethics he quite liked. And in fact, there's a work by Cicero called The Stoic Paradoxes. By paradoxes, he meant principles, in fact. And the reason why I called them paradoxes was because he was defending them against criticisms by some of his contemporaries. So Cicero, of course, is a figure of the very end of the Republic and the beginning of the period that led to the empire during the great time of the civil wars. So we're thinking of Cicero as being somebody who would have been an historical figure even for Seneca and Epictetus in the 1st century AD. And by that time, this second significant change had happened. Not only had the logical and metaphysical part of Stoicism disappeared, but also the idea of the logos, of the principle of reason, the principle of order in the universe, had started to be personified as a deity. Seneca describes this principle as providence, providentia, as something which is, as it were, intelligent or conscious. So when he writes about things like consolation and constancy and how to manage your emotions, your anger and the like, and there are many marvelous essays by Seneca on these topics, the moral essays. They fill 4 or 5 volumes of the lower library. He there invokes this idea of providence. And if you conform to the Stoic principles of courage and of self-mastery, if you apply reason to recognize those things that are indifferent, that don't ultimately affect you, even if they might be useful to have and so on, and keep focused on those things that really do matter, courage and justice, truth. if you do that, then providence is going to look after you. It's not that you yourself personally have achieved ataraxia by these means, as Zeno and Cleanthes and Chrysippus would have said, but instead that it is as if, it's almost in a way hearkening back to the figurative use of the idea of the eudaimon, the good demon or the good angel looking after you in Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle didn't mean it literally, but the idea of eudaimonia was the idea of having a kind of providential life. And this had become something sufficiently personalized for the Christians later, several centuries later, to find in Seneca what they regarded as prefigurings of a very congenial ethical outlook for themselves. And this is something which was picked up by Epictetus. He also talks as if the logos is something which is intelligent and conscious and purposive in the universe, and so too Marcus Aurelius. Now to talk a little bit about the later effects of all this. The effects that Marcus Aurelius has had was really on the late Renaissance and the Enlightenment for a reason that I will explain in a moment. But just to mention straight away that, of course, his writings were his own personal private diary, and he was writing to himself. He was not writing for publication. He had been bred up in the Stoic tradition. He had had Stoic tutors. He had learned the late Stoic outlook from these discussions. I mean, not only from Seneca and Epictetus, but from Epictetus's teacher Musonius Rufus, who was a very, very famous figure in the Rome of his day. Stoicism, therefore, was something that recommended itself tremendously, especially to educated people, both in the Hellenic and in the Roman periods, indeed. And very, very many of the patrician offspring had Stoic tutors as a result, because it conformed so very well with the Roman character. And those of you who know a bit about Roman history and Roman legend, if you think about Horatius on the bridge and Mucius Scaevola and all these great characters to exemplify the sort of Roman virtues, those Roman virtues are very, very much Stoic virtues. Well, in the 4th century AD, when Christianity was made the official religion of the empire, the late 4th century. You may remember Constantine had decriminalized Christianity in the early part of that century, and then Theodosius I, by the Edict of Thessalonica, I think it was in 380 AD, said that Christianity is the religion of the empire, and all other religions are now, as it were, banned. At that time, which again, nearly 400 years into the story of Christianity, and Christianity had for a long time been a minority avocation in various parts of the empire, had at times been persecuted because it didn't conform with the Roman view of religion. Just to remind you of the etymology of the term religion, it comes from religio, religere, which means to bind. We get our word ligature from the same root. And in the Roman conception of public religion, this, for a very, very diverse and enormous empire with so many different languages, ethnicities, traditions, customs, and so on, religion was a way of binding together or bringing together the empire in great public festivals, worshipping the emperor or Jupiter and so forth. And because the Christians wouldn't take part in that, and they wouldn't worship the pagan gods or a living god, the emperor, they were regarded as subversive. And for that reason, they were from time to time persecuted quite severely on occasion. But when they finally, after Constantine and in the 4th century, Christianity became something very acceptable to the more educated classes of Romans. And they also, at that time too, apologetical literature made it possible for the educated classes to accept Christianity. And just to give you one little example, the educated classes tended also to be the wealthy classes, but it says in scripture that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into heaven. So it's a bit problematic. Also, the Roman Empire was an enormous and powerful military empire, yet the scriptures tell us about turning the other cheek and blessed are the peacemakers. And so these things needed to be dealt with, a bit of spin needed to be put on these principles. And fortunately, in that same period of the late 4th century, early 5th, St. Augustine, who was a great interpreter, said things like, for example, well, if the rich give their alms to the poor, the souls of the poor will conduct them into heaven. And this reconciled the rich with the idea of a scriptural religion of Christianity's kind, which in its origins, in its fundamental principles, seem much closer to Cynicism of the 4th century BCE than it did to the Rome of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. But it was also the case, however, that by the 4th century AD, the teachings of the scriptures had come to seem to pose other difficulties as well. If you go to the scriptures, the Gospels, and you put to them the question, how should I live? What should I do in order to attain the kingdom? The answer that you get will be, you get two kinds of answers. One kind of answer is very familiar to all moral systems. You know, look after the widows and orphans, treat your fellow men as your neighbors, and so on. This goes way back. You can go to the China of the 2nd, 3rd centuries BCE, to Moism. Love your fellow men as your brothers, be kind to the widows and orphans. This was a very common and obviously a very good principle that many moral outlooks shared, not just Christianity. What was distinctive about Christianity was the instruction in the scriptures to give away everything that you have. Take no thought for the morrow. Think of the lilies of the field, they neither spin nor weave. St. Paul says, don't marry unless you're going to burn. Now, all this is because early Christianity really sincerely believed that the parousia, the second coming, was imminent. The Messiah was coming back this week, next month, very soon. So you don't need money, you don't make plans, you don't start a family. And these teachings of the scriptures and how to achieve the kingdom led many people over the next couple of centuries to repudiate everything, to give everything up. I mean, really to live in a lifestyle more cynical than the Cynics, off into the deserts, the Hesychas, the desert fathers, live up on the top of a pillar like Simon Stylites and the rest, in order to renounce the world and all its works and the devil, and just to wait for the Messiah to come, and making no plans and having no possessions, etc. Well, by the 4th century, when this was a religion that was becoming attractive to a wider range of people, the church fathers, of course, St. Jerome and various others had been writing apologetics, which were making the case for the credibility of the miracle stories and so on. A more livable kind of ethics needed, and it was borrowed more or less wholesale from Stoicism. From Stoicism mainly, but also to some extent from the Aristotelian tradition. In Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle had very much valorized the idea of the person who strove to live with some nobility, strove to live a life of reason, of thought, and of self-command. I mean, not that different in a way from Stoicism, but without that inner kind of austerity that the Stoics had sought for, the early Stoics. And this idea of what Aristotle had called the megalopsychos, the great magna anima, the great soul, the great souled individual, became a very central idea in Christianity, what in the English tradition of describing it, sometimes called the Christian gentleman or the Christian gentlewoman, the great souled person, the generous person. Of course, generosa, so generous is cognate with magna anima. So that was one element. But the element of Stoicism, that is of having faith that providence will, as the name suggests, provide, so that treating the world as a testing ground, there will be disasters, pain, struggles, illness, aging, death to deal with. And these are things you must confront with courage, but you must try to achieve the life of virtue, the Christian life by submitting yourself to the teachings, by exercising that internalized control. These are very much features of Stoicism that were borrowed and adapted. And they were borrowed and adapted at about the same time that some of the metaphysics and epistemology of Neoplatonism were brought into Christianity. Because of course it was, early Christianity had been very Judaic in its outlook. St. Paul, for example, thought that when people died, they would be buried. And then when the Messiah returned, the graves would open and the dead would rise from the graves. And the belief became very widespread that those who had died as believers, as martyrs and saints, would not rot in the grave. Their bodies would be preserved. Well, when in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Christianity was the official religion of the empire, and many churches were being built and temples were being converted, saints and martyrs were being exhumed so that their relics could be in these places in the hope of performing miracles. And they were found, in fact, to have rotted in the grave. There was nothing left but bones. A new account of this was needed. Now, Plato had devised the idea of the immortal soul, which encounters the forms in the realm of being, in which knowledge of which is true knowledge, you may remember, and when the soul is incorporated at conception or birth, whenever that happens, it forgets everything. You may remember Plato's theory of unforgetting, that to learn something is not to learn something new, but to be reminded of something you knew before you were born, because your immortal soul had pre-existed your birth. This idea was a component of Neoplatonism, so the later Platonic view, nearly 1,000 years now, after Plato's own time, 900 years, and it was adopted into Christian thinking, the idea of the immortal soul, which goes to purgatory to be shrived of its sins, and so on. So at that time, Christianity was borrowing very heavily from the Greek philosophical schools, from Neoplatonism, from Stoicism, from aspects of the peripatetic ethics of Aristotle. And that meant that those views persisted through the great length of time which has followed since then, up till our own day. Aspects of the moral theology of Christianity contain elements of Stoic thinking. So that is one way in which this happened. The other way in which it happened was that the writings of Marcus Aurelius, which are a particularly beautiful expression of late Stoicism, of the Stoicism where if you really want to see it worked out in detail, you read Seneca and you read the Enchiridion and the discourses of Epictetus. But to see how a fine, thoughtful mind took these Stoic teachings and tried to apply them to himself in circumstances where Stoicism was at a premium. I mean, in the sense that if you were living as Marcus Aurelius was on the Danube frontier at a time when the empire was very sorely pressed from without, having to live a hardy military life and from that position encamped on the banks of the Danube to run an enormous empire, he, in his self-instruction, using these Stoic tenets, articulated a way of doing it, a way of living as a Stoic, which is, as I say, a particularly beautiful version of that view. And Aurelius's diary, which was called, I mean, the title that he gave it was To Himself, because he was writing to himself. When it was published in English in the 17th century AD, so very, very long time afterwards, in a translation by a man called Merrick Casaubon, it was given the title Meditations. By the way, it's of interest to sort of the people who like the highways and byways of these things, as I rather do, that Merrick Casaubon was the son of Isaac Casaubon, a very great scholar of the ancient languages, a great classicist, one of the greatest. It was he who identified the so-called Hermetic literature, which had been claimed for some centuries beforehand to be of very, very, very ancient provenance, to have come perhaps from before the time of Moses, or perhaps even earlier than that, and as conveying the teachings of somebody who had lived were so close to the origin of things that they had the very purest view of the nature of the world and the nature of God. And this individual was Hermes Trismegistus. Trismegistus meaning thrice great. That figure of Hermes, as you know, Hermes was, among other things, the patron deity of writing, of learning, but he was also a psychopomp. A psychopomp is a supernatural agent who conducts the souls of the dead to the place of the dead, to Hades in Greek mythology. In Egyptian mythology, the god Thoth, which is a bit difficult to say when you've been to the pub in the evening. Thoth was also the god of the scribes and the learned, and he was also a psychopomp, also took the souls into the afterlife. And therefore Hermes and Thoth were regarded as the same individual. And the identification of them turns on the fact that Hermes was called Trismegistus, thrice great, because Thoth in Egyptian mythology was always referred to as Thoth the Great, the Great, the Great, thrice great. So the identification was made on that basis. But Isaac Casaubon, and the name Casaubon, of course, was used by George Eliot for a very different kind of character later, alas, in Middlemarch. But Isaac Casaubon studied the Greek in which the Hermetic literature was written and recognized it as 2nd century Greek. 2nd century AD Greek, and not, the Greek of the pre-Mycenaean times. So it was a wonderful discovery and a very important one at that late period of the Renaissance, early Enlightenment. Anyway, his son, Merrick Casaubon, translated the writings of Aurelius, published it as the Meditations, and it instantly became a bestseller. Now that it was published in the 17th century, so about a third of the way through 17th century, became a great bestseller. Many, many people read it, and it became very influential in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, of course, of the 17th, but especially 18th century, was predicated on the rejection of hegemonic control over people by absolute monarchs and over thought by a totalizing religion. The rejection of authority over the person, so the person has individual rights, and over the mind, so the mind can think freely of doctrine and dogma, to inquire, to conduct research, to do science. I mean, the scientific revolution of the 17th century followed on the Reformation, not because the Protestant parts of Europe were friendlier to science than the Catholic parts. I mean, in the Catholic parts, right up until nearly the middle of the 17th century, they were still persecuting people like Giordano Bruno and Galileo and the rest, but because in the Protestant parts of Europe, the churches didn't have enough power to shut people up. They couldn't exert enough control, and it was therefore in those parts that the rise of science was most marked in the late 16th and the 17th centuries. But this idea of removal of these authorities meant that people could start to think again about about ethics and about the principles of ethics. Because for all those many, many centuries before, the question, how should I live and what is good, was answered. The church had the answer. It told you how to live, and it told you what the aim of life is, and it told you what is good and what is bad. And therefore the discussions that antiquity, the classical and Hellenic and Roman antiquity, those discussions that people had had then about the principles of the good life, how one should live, and those different schools, the Aristotelian, the Epicurean, the Cynic, the Stoic schools, giving their different answers to this question, all that had stopped. The Stoic ideas had been incorporated in Christianity, as I say, but debates about the foundations of ethics had ceased. And this is why it is so remarkable, because actually the 18th century Enlightenment, and in particular the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume and Thomas Reid and Adam Smith, also in England with Shaftesbury and Hutchinson, this was a revival of thinking about ethics. And one of the most significant inputs into thinking about ethics was, of course, Stoicism. There is an essay by David Hume on Stoicism in which, and he's very critical about all the different schools, very critical about the Epicureans, for example. And this is natural because you're not going to agree with absolutely everything that some previous writer had said, or some school of thought had taught. You're going to be critical. You're going to look at some aspects of what they say and disagree with them. But on the whole, Hume found the basic ideas of Stoicism very, very attractive. And he therefore made an effort to incorporate that kind of thinking into a view he held, very important for him, view, which was at odds with Stoicism. The Stoics have said that you apply reason to your emotions to govern them. Hume, those of you who've read him remember, he said that reason is the handmaid of the emotions, that in the end, the thing that really guides us and motivates us, all our actions, the springs of our actions, come from how we feel about things, from our emotions. And that reason is subordinate to them, the handmaid of the passions, as he put it. Whereas, of course, Stoicism taught that reason is the ruler of our passions. But nevertheless, he believed that the insights of Stoicism were of sufficient value that their idea about treating the indifferents, about seeking to identify the things that really mattered so that one could live with the kind of ataraxia, the kind of stability, self-mastery, self-control that would navigate one through all the difficulties and tumults of life. That, he thought, was something worth celebrating. And so, like Cicero before him, and Hume was a great admirer of Cicero, he did what Cicero did. Cicero was an academic skeptic when it came to metaphysics and epistemology, but was very, very attracted by the Stoic outlook. And that applies also to Hume. And that Hume view is something which now, today, in our present world, is proving itself very attractive to a large number of people. Hume had dropped that aspect of late Stoicism, which had turned the logos, the idea of the order of things, into a deity, into a providence. So contemporary Stoicism, in its association with contemporary humanism, is a view which says that by the application of reason, by thinking about how we're to live, by living what, and this is the ultimate source of Stoicism in that aspect of Socrates, living the considered life, we can live a life which is good. Now, I see I've gone on far too long, and I'm very sorry about that. So, Rupert, we better turn our attention to some questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor Grayling, for a fascinating lecture. No one, I imagine, thought you were going on too long. I could have listened for much longer. However, we do have a number of questions. The first one is from Lacrage Minas. How, if at all, was Marcus Aurelius influenced by his tutor Fronto in his articulation of Stoicism?
Oh, I think very much. I mean, this was, if you like, really rather standard feature of the education of the educated and wealthier upper classes. And it was, in the air that people breathed, this kind of outlook. And as I said, it conformed so well with the idea of the Roman republican virtues, because even though the republic had ceased to be and we're well into the empire now, indeed, as Gibbon remarked about the Antonines and about the period of Aurelius's imperium, this was one of the great high points of Roman history. But even so, some of those much earlier republican virtues that were always celebrated and which were so conformable with Stoicism really formed the atmosphere, the medium in which people thought about their ethical lives. And so Aurelius would have been just brought up to think very naturally to find attractive these kinds of views.
Thank you very much. The second question is one I was going to ask, but I'm pleased to see that Anthony Bainbridge has asked it. Given that Zeno introduced the word logos and gave it the meaning in his usage, which of his meanings reads through to St. John, who begins his gospel with the famous words, "In the beginning was the Logos"?
I don't think that Zeno introduced the term logos. It's certainly present in the philosophical tradition already, well before his time. Indeed, when you look more deeply into the metaphysics and logic of the early Stoics, so of Zeno himself, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, you see that they're influenced by, for example, Heraclitus, by the Megarian logicians. The concept of the logos was a quite widely applied concept in philosophical discussions and had been so for some time. So he didn't introduce the notion, but he applied it. He made important use of it. And indeed, this is very apposite question by you, because the St. John thing, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That use of it is tremendously a reflection of the way that thinking about the logos, the principle of the universe, the really key element of it, had become identified with the idea of providence, had become regarded as divine. Very often indeed in pre-Christian writing, you see the phrase, the divine logos. And providentia in Seneca, very much that idea of the divine logos. And so when St. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So this is a bit of quite sophisticated theology, because the Johannine Gospel, of course, is the latest of the four Gospels. And already by that time, it has already elaborated quite a bit of interesting theology. And there you see the presence, as indeed you also do in St. Paul in various places, of the influence of Greek thought.
It is, as you say, the latest of the four Gospels. Would you think that perhaps St. John had actually read Zeno, or you know view on that?
St. Paul of Tarsus.
Yeah.
In Tarsus, there were 4 schools of Greek philosophy present in Tarsus, and there is no question but that St. Paul was very well versed and knew them very well. There's no question of that, but you can see all sorts of indications of it in his various writings. And I'm sure that somebody of the sophistication of mind of John, or whoever wrote the Johannine Gospel, was very familiar with the Greek philosophical tradition. I mean, if you do a comparison, if you think now, any educated person now, anybody who'd read any of the humanities, history or literature or anything like that, would have picked up a great deal of this kind of discussion, or of cognate discussions, anyway, in our contemporary world, and would have been influenced by them. So they would have, everybody knows Descartes, I drink, therefore I am, and they know why that's a joke, and so forth. So, it's that kind of thing at very least. But I'm sure in the case of the author of the Johannine Gospel, that person knew much more and was being very deliberate in that, in the beginning was the Word.
Thank you. Then we come
to logos.
Inter arche ein ho logos. If I remember it right.
Well, you're right. Yes, yeah.
Then we have a question from Christopher Clark. If you set aside belief in the Christian Trinity and resurrection, and indeed machinery of the Catholic Church, by the time of the Renaissance, how far apart do you consider Stoicism and Christianity to be?
Well, sufficiently not far apart for it to be something that people like Erasmus and quite a number of the Renaissance humanists to find congenial. It was certainly congenial to Erasmus, to Melanchthon, and it was, again, it had become part of the element in which the humanists of the 15th and 16th centuries swam, so to speak, because among the rediscovered texts and the tremendous explosion of publication of texts that followed Gutenberg, the huge admiration that people had for Cicero. You may remember that he was regarded as the master of style. People wanted to write as Cicero did, and very often some of the scholars of the Renaissance refused to use any vocabulary that was earlier or later than Cicero, so purist were they about it. And of course, Cicero's philosophical writings, because Cicero had set himself the task when his political career had more or less come to an end, of trying to get into the Latin conversation many of the ideas of the Greek schools which he had studied. As a young man, indeed, he'd been to Athens, he studied these things, and he was a very good and rather discerning, perceptive commentator on them, and wanted to parlay these debates into the Latin conversation. And therefore, of course, since people were reading Cicero extensively, and they were admiring him, and they were picking up on his attitudes and ideas, the degree to which Stoicism had impressed Cicero himself, especially in the ethical aspect of his thinking, naturally dispersed into the Renaissance mind.
Thank you very much. The fourth question in the list is an interesting one. Are there any modern day public figures who you think could be described as Stoics or who live by Stoic principles?
I don't know myself of anybody who would lay claim to the label, but I do know quite a few people of whom it could justifiably be said that they had internalized some of the key aspects of the Stoic outlook and lived accordingly. Well, one of my own teachers, in fact, I had various teachers who were anything but stoical. For example, one of the most attractive of them was Freddie Eyre, A.J. Eyre, who I was his very last pupil and one of the obituarists, and became rather friendly with him actually after I'd ceased to be his pupil, up till the time that he died. And he wouldn't be a Stoic. But I had a teacher called Timothy Sprigg, T.L.S. Sprigg, who was an idealist philosopher from the metaphysical point of view, that is, he thought that he had a kind of panpsychist view about the ultimate nature of reality. And in that sense, he was a real standout because that kind of idealism, or indeed any kind of idealism, had ceased to persuade a long time ago. But he rather sort of manfully, you might say stoically, adhered to the views that Bradley and Spinoza and others had put forward and argued on their behalf. But it was in the practice of his life. It was how he lived it. One of the very, very few people who had principles and adhered to them and enacted them. And they were principles of directness and simplicity, and of always trying to live according to the truth, by his best lights, by what he took to understand about the nature of the universe. And in that sense, I think he could be very well described as a Stoic.
Thank you very much. Well, you have answered all the questions, I think all the questions in the list. No, one other, which is a short question from an anonymous attendee. Any favorite Stoical quote?
Oh, dear me. No, I can't think of any. I should say, by the way, that if you want if you want neat quotations embodying Stoic principles, the place to look is Seneca, especially in the Latin, because he is a marvelously, aphoristic writer, and his essays are, as it were, strings of aphorisms of a stoical kind. So if you're seeking one, then I direct you to Seneca.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure that will answer the point raised by our questioner. Well, I'm afraid that the time is now up. Professor Grayling, thank you very much indeed for delivering a second hugely stimulating lecture. I have learned a massive amount from it, and I'm sure that everyone else has too. Can I just say a couple of words about Classics for All? First of all, anyone with an affiliation to the legal world is very welcome to join the lawyers group within Classics for All. We welcome all new members. Subscriptions are £150 a year, and in return for your subscription, you come to interesting events such as this. But of course, Classics for All is much more than the lawyers group. It's a very large organization and a very worthwhile charity. It has a large number of supporters, and some of those supporters attend our lawyers group meetings, and they're most welcome to do so. Anybody who wishes to make a donation to Classics for All, which funds the teaching of classics in state schools, especially in areas of social deprivation, is invited to do so, to make their contribution using the Classics for All website. Now, our next meeting, at least our next lawyers group meeting, is going to be on the, I'm embarrassed to say, I have lost the date, our next lawyers group meeting is going to be in June, on the 8th of June. Our speaker will be Professor Michael Scott, familiar to many of you from his numerous television appearances. His title will be Remembering and Forgetting the Past, Athens in 403 BC. That was a time when Athens had just re-established a democracy after its period of oligarchy under the rule of the 30 tyrants. This was a very dramatic period, coming as it did at the end of the Peloponnesian War, and also, of course, coming in the closing years of Socrates' life, because our speaker this evening has reminded us that Socrates died was executed in 399 BC, or as some would say BCE. So that's our next meeting. It's going to be an online event like this one. All members of the lawyers group will be very welcome to attend it at no cost, and anyone else who would like to attend in return for payment of a modest ticket price will be very welcome, and I hope there will be a large attendance. Michael Scott is a trustee of Classics for All, as indeed am I, and Michael Scott is an excellent commentator on matters concerning the ancient world, as you will have seen from his television programs. Finally, we are going to close this evening's meeting with a film about the work of Classics for All in the Blackpool area. So I will say good night and thank you to you all, and thank you very much, Professor Grayling. I will now switch off my camera and sound, and we will all watch the film about the work of Classics for All in Blackpool.
My name's Peter Wright. I teach at the Blackpool Sixth Form College, where I lead the Classical Civilization and the Ancient History course. So you think of Blackpool and you think of a very successful seaside entertainment town, but underneath the surface there's a lot of social and economic problems. We want to get Latin into the schools because, first of all, is the key aim of driving and improving aspiration with our local students in terms of university and in terms of employment opportunities, and even just something simple as travel and experience and appreciation of the local environment that they've got as well.
Here we have 50% of children are pupil premium children, so it's really, really important that we give those children, alongside the other children in Blackpool, the same experiences and the same enriched curriculum.
So with support from Classics for All, we've managed to get Latin and classics into all of these schools by training up non-specialist teachers. So we've had over 15 teachers now trained to deliver either Latin or classics and literature and history through the training that we've been able to put on through Classics for All.
The training from Blackpool Sixth Form was excellent. Pete came in and really invigorated the teachers, made it really easy for them to deliver, and that's why it's been so successful. There's
also the huge benefits about improving their vocabulary, their grammar, their whole English literacy, and also in terms of a springboard to get them to appreciate and to engage with modern foreign languages as well.
Quizzes?
Well, with the Latin, it's brought them alive. They love the Latin lessons. They can't wait to try and work out the meanings of words.
Minimus.
Learning Latin has had a huge impact on the children. They love the classical context, they love that other languages derive from this, they like the history, the myths about the Romans and how it all started, and they're asking more questions, becoming more inquisitive about other subjects. We started out as a club, but they've started fighting over who can go to this club, so it's changed now that we want to add it to the curriculum and enable all the children to access this exciting opportunity.
It's really awakened something in them, and I think Latin is the language of the future.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Well, I love Latin, how it can help you with your vocabulary, and I love how it can help you get a future job, like if you were a lawyer or a doctor, and it's great how we're one of the few schools who are actually learning Latin.
You can learn words from it and know what they mean, and especially it can help you in everyday life.
I like Latin because if you do your GCSEs on plants later, most of plants' names are Latin, so it'll help you with it. And I also like the myths and legends in the books. I want to be a pilot when I grow up, and if I go to like a different country and I don't know what they're going to be saying, I will know because of my lessons inside Latin.
I study classics because I've loved the study of the ancient world ever since I was a child. I'd always read books on Rome or Egypt, and doing classics at the sixth form was just an amazing opportunity for me. And now I'm going on to Cambridge University at Sydney Sussex College to study archaeology and Egyptology. It's just fantastic.
Classics is still relevant today because the politics we have nowadays is very similar to the way it was before.
I think it's relevant because it teaches you to question the accuracy of sources, and it transfers the skills over so that you don't believe everything.
I love Latin because the English is derived from Latin, and our teacher lets us guess the answers rather than just telling us. I love the stories because they're said in Latin, we can also learn it and it's fun. And when I grow up, I would love to be a doctor, and most of the doctor's terminologies are in Latin.
If it wasn't for Classics for All, we would not have 9 schools delivering Latin or classics. We wouldn't have 13 teachers trained up to deliver those things, and we wouldn't have over 500 students every single week engaging in Latin or classics.